You're listening to the Mashup Americans.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Lehrer.
And I'm Amy Choi, and we are the Mashup Americans. And Rebecca, the rest of this year, this is our late incoming goal of 2023, is we are going to set boundaries. And I know we say that all the time, but this time it's really happening, and we are going to rest.
Oh, cool.
Cool. But we're going to do it, right?
Totally in. I have this huge to-do list with multiple on different platforms. There's a written ones. There's the ones in a Apple Notes that are shared. There's a Trello board. So I'll just get through those and then boundaries. Is that how that works?
Well, first you have to plan your parents' vacations, and then also I need to make somehow grocery list for the next 7 months of my life.
That's right. But also in some ways, this feels just like champagne problems, caviar dreams, to quote, Robin, whatever, from The Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. I won't do my Australian accent right now. But, mashups don't get stressed, right? If you're an immigrant to this country, you're not being like, I'm so stressed. You just are stressed. You're just doing it. And you've probably been through many layers of root shock and change and all of that. And you're just doing it. So there's no acknowledgement of the impact it's happening because you can't do that. This is what we talked about in Grief Collected. So then it's like, I need a massage. I'm tired.
I know. But if nothing else, what is the great American dream is so that we can continue to evolve.
That's right.
And also there's maybe no word for being stressed out because it's a state of being, but there's also not that many words for being relaxed and happy. And I would like that in my life.
I wonder if it's the kind of thing, it's not German. You know how they're always like, of course there's a German word for, I hate that person because they were rude to my mom or something. There's just one long word.
Because they have one long tooth. Yes.
Yeah, who do we think has a word for just all the words for just being happy?
Bhutan. Bhutan, Finnish people.
Yeah.
Well, so what we are learning about taking care of ourselves, about actually resting, which gives ourselves back to ourselves, is that it's not just massages and manicures, though we love massages and manicures. It's actually setting boundaries, getting help, asking for help, and, changing the shitty capitalist misogynistic system that is trying to extract every last ounce of our souls out of us.
Yes. And we are, we're both moms of elementary aged kids, and we're in the sandwich generation as well. And we're mashups, and we need help.
We need help. So bad. So we went to an expert. Our guest today is Dr. Pooja Lakshmin. She's a board-certified psychiatrist focused on women's mental health and dismantling toxic wellness culture. Her best-selling book, it's so great. It is called Real Self-Care, Crystals, Cleanses, and Bubble Baths Not Included. It's out now. Pooja is the clinical assistant professor of psychiatry at George Washington University School of Medicine, and she has a private practice where she treats women struggling with burnout, perfectionism, and disillusionment. And I'm feeling read like a book, like a filthy read of me. We're so excited to have Pooja here with us today.
So, Pooja, we're going to start. How do you mash up?
I think, when you guys say mash up, thinking about all of the things that make us who we are. And, me being the eldest daughter of immigrant parents. Both of my parents were born in India. My grandfather on my paternal side immigrated to the United States as a academic. Because of our caste, he wasn't getting the opportunities that he deserved in India. And so he came here, and my dad came with, and then my dad went back to India for medical school, had an arranged marriage with my mom. And then she came when she was in her 20s. She left her whole family. So that absolutely kind of informs my life and my decisions now. And what else about me is a mashup? I'm partnered with a white guy, and I have a little son who is racially ambiguous. And
Wait, what is it like if you're not East Asian? What's a Hapa version of
Indian?
Of Indian? What if I was like mestizo?
If you were a white male author, you'd be like caramel latte.
Yeah. Oh God, get out of here.
The
Get out of
word that
here.
always comes to mind for me, that's the Bollywood word, is Wheatish.
Oh,
Wheatish.
well, that's like the, what's that Fair and Lovely, the like skin lightening nonsense? Holy crap. Well, speaking of white supremacy, we're going to get into it.
Dive right in.
Yeah. But I think one thing I just want to start with, which is we can also make this into a psychiatric therapy session for me, but I'll try not to. It's just hard, is that I am a person who likes to make things happen. And I think that's why I love to read acknowledgments in books. I'm the first person that Amy has ever known that reads acknowledgments. I think most people don't.
She has also discovered acknowledgments of like me in books because the first thing she does is flip to the, and I was like, what? That was there?
I feel like it's very telling of like how people think about the work. I mean, how they
It's
think
the behind the scenes.
Yeah, who makes things happen, and I'm curious about
yeah.
who it is, like the actual people.
Yeah.
Sometimes if I would know them, but more the whole thing. And then the flip to my own therapy session here is that I was acknowledged in this book,
She was.
and I was like, is that all I want? Maybe like to be acknowledged.
Ever in life, yes.
Is that why we're all here?
But I just wanted to be acknowledged. So thank you for acknowledging me. And with acknowledgement of that, we have so much to talk about with your book, what boundaries look like, what taking care of ourselves looks like as mashups. But Amy wants to start with something.
Okay.
I need to start with something because your book, Real Self-Care, is so clear and so great. And there's so many deep things to dive into and tools for us. But most importantly, I need to learn about orgasmic meditation. And like, I know we're not trying to join a cult here today and that you may have already done that. But like, I have serious questions about what this is. And can you please teach us about it? And
like, what are wait, question. Do you want to know like the good stuff, which is like, how do we orgasmically meditate?
I just want to know about
cult?
the whole concept of orgasmic meditation.
Okay.
And then we can go from there. And I bet just hearing the words, I'm like, well, I can see why one would join a cult that is centered on orgasmic meditation.
Yeah, well, we're diving right in. So there's tons of places where you can do the Google, you can, see what it's all about. For me, what was really interesting was, like we were talking about mashup, I came from a South Asian family that's super patriarchal, right? Being the eldest daughter and sort of having all the rules of what girls are allowed to do and not allowed to do and what boys are allowed to do and not allowed to do. That was sort of always informing my upbringing and how I thought of myself. And then I went to Penn for undergrad and was a women's studies major and took all these classes and learned all this stuff. And I guess all that to say, like, I was always kind of I had that spark of like rage, right? And then I went into medical school, thought I was going to be an OBGYN, but ultimately realized that I didn't like being in the OR. I didn't want to be a surgeon. I wanted to talk to people. But then I found that psychiatry wasn't what I thought it would be. Like, there's obviously so many inconsistencies and injustices and contradictions in psychiatry. All that to say, once I left mainstream medicine and found like this group, that was talking about orgasmic meditation and like pleasure and spirituality and sensuality and kind of putting it on this pedestal, like saying that like we're allowed to have that. It was so compelling to me. It was like, felt like what I had been kind of looking for my whole life. And that's why I put the whole story of that part of my life. I mean, this was about almost more than a decade ago at this point. I put that up front in the book. I decided to kind of really share that in the introduction because I wanted everybody who read Real Self-Care to understand that I was coming to this not as only a psychiatrist, but also somebody who's like very much gone down the deepest rabbit hole of woo-woo wellness, like who just went really, really far and came out the other side.
Well, you know what? There's something too with this, and we'll get into more through this, but what I also hear is like, and I think we can all relate to this, how much we are in our heads. And then you literally are like, I'm studying the science of your head, kind of your, like how to help your head and your brain and what all, but like that we do live in bodies, and trying to connect all of that together is like, I think as first gen, as like there's lots of layers of unpacking there, but we're still trying to do that all the time, into our 40s, like trying to be like, no, pleasure or loving your body or accepting your body or
even being in your body.
Just being embodied. Yeah.
Right. And that was the whole premise with everything that this group was doing, that it was sort of accessing and being connected to your body, which was really compelling and powerful. And what I learned on the other side of it is that there is no magic panacea. It's not like you just learn one practice or find one guru or do some diet and then everything's fixed. It still actually comes back down to making hard choices in your life. There's no shortcut. I mean, it's a very depressing message, to be honest. There's no shortcut.
There is no shortcut, but it does at least, I think, clarify this idea, like everything that both of you have just been saying about being in your body and like being the eldest daughter, being a woman, being an immigrant kid. The definitions of almost all of those things they're defined by like women sublimating all of their pleasure. It's just like you cannot really be like a good daughter if you're putting your body and your pleasure or just like earthly delights first, because that's like diametrically opposed to being a good Indian daughter.
Correct.
Right? Like other people are always supposed to come first. And I just think that can be more explicit as a mashup, but it's actually like all of women.
Yes. And that's one of the things with real self-care, that once you kind of dive into it and start to like kind of look at whether it's boundaries or compassion or like values, what you really want in your life, there's so many layers, because it shows up in certainly big choices. Like for me, it was like, oh, am I going to be a doctor? Am I going to get married? What school am I going to go to? Right? All those sort of like big choices in your life. But it shows up in the day-to-day little stuff too. Like, am I going to give myself permission to like actually eat lunch today? Like at a table away from my desk.
Right.
And how that is actually, there's embodiment in that. There's rebellion in that small decision.
Right.
It's not just scarfing down our sad desk salad.
Right.
Oh my God. The way that
salad.
I spent my entire 20s with a sad desk salad.
Yes.
Oh, the worst. Well, listen, again, first gen, we're going to really get into boundaries today. One thing is, how did you tell your immigrant parents that you were in a cult, or that you were joining this group? And again, you talk about this all very explicitly in your book, and how it's just as you just said, it was already 10 years ago. And so we're not trying to deficit frame here. We're just like, it's like the extreme of, and I think that's part of how you talk about it. It's like the extreme, but it's actually at its core what we're all seeking is we're trying to find that answer for this, whether it's rebellion or find ourselves in some way. But how did you tell your parents? I mean, that feels so hard for us to do, us as mashups.
Yeah, this is an interesting question, because I haven't thought about this for a long time. I don't even know if I explicitly told them in the beginning. I think I just did it.
Did you tell them that you were leaving med school?
That's the question I have.
I did. And I honestly, I don't remember. It was residency. I don't remember exactly how. I've probably blocked it out. So one of the reasons that I made the decision to talk about it up front in the book was because it was not the right way. Like, I didn't do it skillfully. There was a lot of damage.
Yeah.
I didn't talk to my parents for quite a while. And it was me leaving my marriage, leaving residency, and joining the cult was all kind of one big storm, one big sort of rupture and extreme boundary setting for me. Again, like you said, Rebecca, this is not the healthy way to do it. Don't follow in my footsteps, folks. But it was the only way that I knew how, because at that point I was like 27, 28, and I had spent my whole life until that point doing all the things I was supposed to. Go to the Ivy League school, become a doctor, get married, do all the things. And I don't want to say that like, look, those were all my choices. I was an adult, and my parents were, as Indian immigrant parents, they were pushing me in that direction because it offered stability, it offered prestige, it offered a certain amount of safety.
Yep.
So it wasn't wrong or misguided on their behalf. And there was a huge amount of privilege too that enabled me to do all of those things that, you know, I didn't have student loans because of how much my grandparents had saved, right? So, you know, there's a lot of privilege. But I had never so openly said no to them.
Yeah.
You know, and so it was just kind of like all pent up. And then there was this big sort of rupture.
You know, we're talking now about what it feels like to be in our body. And sometimes, like Rebecca will hear me, I was like, oh, today's one of those days I'm going to peel all my skin off. It feels like you just cannot be contained anymore. And I wonder, what did that feel like for you?
Certainly there was a lot of anger at sort of all of the establishment institutions, whether that was family, whether that was medicine and psychiatry. So it felt like a breaking free. And again, in a way that was very dramatic and hurt a lot of people too, right? So it was a breaking free at the expense of others. But for me, it felt like there was a liberation. Finally kind of like being able to exert myself or my voice too, and processing that, everything that came after that, sort of the trauma of it, but then also the freedom of it too, and the liberation that I felt is sort of what led to writing Real Self-Care, in that kind of this realization that there's a distillation of this. Like, yes, that was very much an extreme, but there's ways that if you learn how to do it in much smaller steps, if you implement those tiny little pieces, that's the healthy way.
You talked about this idea, which we both loved so much, about getting curious about your anger and microdosing your capacity to receive. It was so powerful to hear that idea about getting curious and then thinking about it as microdosing or separating it into it doesn't have to be the extreme. But we all feel often, right? Like that we need that extreme. There's something where you're like, that's the only answer, is I'm just going to like pull it all.
But I mean, I think that's like the one where the woman runs away in New York City.
Oh yeah. Fleischman is in trouble.
Fleischman, like, don't we all kind of have this fantasy of just like running away?
But then they find her in her own apartment.
Well, you know, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I remember actually before, now that we're talking about it, there was a moment, like a couple, I don't know how long before it was, where I said, I want to go just live on a farm. You know, I just want to be somewhere where things are simple, right? And it's this fantasy, this like longing for like a life that isn't complicated, like almost like a life that is not a mashup.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I get that feeling sometimes when I think about people that I went to high school with that stayed in my hometown, which was a predominantly white, central-ish Pennsylvania, upper middle class town, and people who, you know, whose parents grew up in that town and got married to each other, and you know, they're all, it's like their place. It's like a home, and you stay there, and you get married and you have kids and you're part of the community. And I understand like that there's struggles and things too, but it just feels so much less complicated. Whereas somebody like me, we're talking about mashup, right? Where I have to like go do all these things to prove myself to the world, to prove myself to myself, right?
Well, also the ancestral stuff, like your grandfather coming.
And he had to come here because of his caste, because he had to find another way forward. Yeah.
Right.
And whether your family, I assume, told that story to you, but they also, it's like the other things that are untold, right? About why that then you have a job, a certain kind of role in this family to like, you know, in a casteless society. I'm putting big quotes around that about America. You know, now you have to cement our class, basically.
Right. Have fun with that, Pooja.
Yeah. Good luck.
Yeah. Good luck, Pooja.
Have fun at Penn.
I know you want to live on a farm. I do sometimes feel this way about men. where I'm like, what was Amy saying the other day? You were saying about like some people don't have inner monologues, and you're like, what is happening in your brain? Is it just quiet?
They don't have an inner monologue. So is it just quiet all the time?
Yeah.
What are you talking about?
I mean, I feel that with Justin sometimes where he will just, because he's a white man, where it's like he will just think something and want to do something and just do it.
Yeah.
Just do it. What? What is he even talking about? I don't understand that at all.
Or I ask them about their bodies. Like at least I have a slim white man husband.
Who is adorable.
The best.
We love him.
The best.
He's
the best ever. But I'll be like, do you ever like think about how your like shirt is touching how it feels when it touches your waist or hips or like body? And he's like, no. And I was like, I need you to know that like a good 40% of any woman's energy that they don't even realize they're using is about how their clothes are touching their body, like moving it around, and just like the amount of energy used for shit like that to, could be harnessed in different ways, basically.
Could be. But I think that the thing about curiosity that is so striking is that it really pairs with this idea that I think you nail in the early parts of your book about how so often women are trying to run away from themselves, and that's what they use what you call faux self-care to do. And first of all, it makes me so sad that that could be true. And I also, if I let myself get agitated by that, I'm like, oh, she's fucking right. And you talk also a lot about shame in your book, which I think is really powerful. But the idea that we can allow ourselves to ask questions about like why we want to run away so bad, and we don't have to feel ashamed of that, or we don't have to feel bad for that, or somehow externalize that into like getting a pretty manicure.
I do have a good manicure though right now.
You do have a really good one right now.
Yeah.
And I love one. But does it change anything? No.
Well, it doesn't change this idea of like the systems didn't change.
Right.
Yeah.
What are some of the challenges, like as you outlined, about doing these, what you say, crystals and cleanses and bubble baths like that and manicures, that are they Band-Aids even? Or how would you describe that versus like what it really means to take care of yourself?
Yeah. So I kind of think of it, I have these two buckets. I name sort of the faux self-care, which is sort of like the consumer-based products and services, whether it's the essential oils or the massage or the mani-pedi or the retreat, right? Or even the productivity solutions like the Evernote or the bullet
that one was
journals.
so rude.
So rude. We were so upset.
People
about
got
that.
very upset
dare
about
you?
that. People are very upset about that.
I was like, did she just say illusion of control here?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Like I'm not trying to demonize those things, but I'm trying to say that we use them as tools, whereas real self-care is internal principle work that actually changes you on the inside. And when you're changed on the inside, that naturally impacts your relationships, whether that's with your partner, with your kids. And then it even has the potential to impact your communities and the larger social structures. So it's not that faux self-care is bad. It's that it's less about the thing and it's more about the process that you take to get to the thing. So if we just take an example, so like getting a massage, you can imagine two very different ways to get a massage. You can have one person who is on the massage table and hasn't set any boundaries, hasn't had any hard conversations, hasn't thought more deeply about why this massage is important to her. And she's on the massage table and she's like gritting her teeth the whole time and worried that maybe she's not asking for the right pressure. Maybe she's not making the best use of her time. 20 minutes in, she's like, oh my God, the massage is already over. I can't believe I wasted all this time in my head. After the massage, she comes back to her desk and has like 50 emails and feels like she needs to respond to everything quickly to make up for the lost productivity. That's faux self-care because you haven't internalized any of the actual deeper process of what do I really need in my relationships, in my life, in my work, and how do I make that happen, versus somebody who has thought deeply about, let's say, embodiment, as we're talking about, and notice that when they make time for body work in their life, they are able to feel more in touch and grounded and they're able to make more clear choices about what they want and how they spend their time. So then they went and they actually maybe had a hard conversation with their partner about the division of labor, or maybe they decided to have a hard talk with their boss about, signing off from email at 4 p.m. on Wednesdays so that they had more, or at least some discretionary time where there was also childcare so they could do something for themselves. And then they went to the massage and they were able to actually be there and be present and come back and not feel like they needed to make up for the lost productivity. And because they had those conversations with other people in their lives, it has the power that, I'm not saying every time it's going to be some sort of revolution. No, but it at least has a chance, because when we stay in just the bubble bath, it's a commercial solution. It doesn't do anything to change anybody else. But when it's a personal solution and it changes how you think about what you deserve and how you spend your time, then we at least have the chance of getting to collective action.
What do you think one of the like bridges there is? Like, what's the chance there? So if let's say we all get, okay, I don't want to use the word really good at doing good real self-care.
I would like an A.
As a model minority, I do feel sad halfway through every massage when they ask you to flip over, and I'm like, oh no, it's halfway done. So I felt that was also rude of you. But when you say that, thinking about what some of the opportunities are for collective action are there? Is it knowing that this isn't just us and something that we created the problem, that it's like a system-wide thing that then allows us to feel less pressure and be connected with other folks who are experiencing this? Or what's the opportunity there?
Yeah. Well, I have some examples in the book. I work with women in my clinical practice. So most of my patients are pregnant and postpartum. So a lot of the examples in the book have to do with that stage of life, but it can apply in lots of different places. So a patient who learns how to set boundaries and understands that she needs more support in the home and urges her partner to ask for parental leave. And in that case, the company said yes, right? It's not the case all the time.
Right.
But if my patient hadn't taken those steps to set boundaries and to ask for what she needed, we would have never gotten to that place.
Totally.
Or another patient who actually takes a leave of absence from work, a mental health leave of absence, and for her OCD and also some other issues that are going on in her family. And then when she comes back, she's actually open about the fact that it was a mental health leave and finds out that there's other folks in her company who have family members with OCD. And they start an ERG in the group to support other folks who are dealing with mental health issues. And at her next annual review, she's actually praised and gets more of a budget to support this. So it led to cultural change.
Yeah.
Again, this isn't every time, but this is what's possible.
Yeah.
And, I think this is a tension in my work, because I am a psychiatrist. I work with people one-on-one. It's sort of like a boots on the ground, like at the individual level. I do think that, I don't think that the solution can only be top down, because in order to get to top down, we need people to understand that it's not their fault. And so many of the folks that come to my practice, when they first come in, you feel like it's your fault, right? You don't have the vocabulary or the words to talk about things like white supremacy or capitalism or microaggressions or any of these things, right? And so when we actually kind of make that known, then you come to see well, I do have some agency here. Not all the power, no, by no means, but in the book I talk about the dialectic and dialectical behavior therapy, kind of both and, that both can be true. And so I don't mean for this to be the answer, because so much of my book and because of my own experience is basically saying there is no the answer, but more that it's a start of a different type of conversation.
I think that's actually something that struck both of us, is if we could talk a little bit more about dialectical thinking and that concept as it applies just to being a mashup. Yeah. And it's even like what you were saying earlier, it would, maybe I would have less to run away from, or less pressures, or less of this thing inside of me that felt so much tension if it were just easier. Like if you just were like a fifth generation white kid that grew up where your parents and grandparents grew up in central Pennsylvania. And that like even that being a mashup for us, we've always conceived of as a dialectical way of being. Like it is both hard to be rooted in traditions that you love and also many of which you just hope to like expel from your life, but you can't. So then how do we do the work to transform to like get to the other place? And I think that that's like, it's very hard to hold that in your mind, even though like for Rebecca and I, it's like really all we want for our lives when, especially right now, the world is very black and white. And I wonder like how you think about that, like the dialectical thinking, like in regard to yourself.
So one, I think that when we're feeling good, like in times of stability in our lives, it's a lot easier to access dialectical thinking, right? You know, in this conversation, I'm thinking about what I was talking about with my parents, right? And the pressures that I faced and kind of being able to acknowledge like they did the best that they could. They did more than the best that they could, right? And I also felt like I had to break free. Both are true. And once I was able to get to a place in my life where I felt better from a mental health standpoint, I'm able to so much more easily hold that and grieve, right? Because you do have to grieve and also accept and have love and generosity and compassion. But when I'm feeling less than or stressed or depressed or anxious, my mind wants to separate things into black and white and put things into categories and to really know the answer and to hold on to one answer, right? So I think maybe reframing it to as opposed to like a black and white thing of like, I can practice dialectical thinking or I can't, to understand that there might be times in your life when you can, and there might be other times in your life where it's harder. And when it becomes more difficult, that's when you know that you're struggling a little bit, right? Yeah. I think conversations like this are so important because I think that, yeah, like you said, we live in a world right now where everything lacks nuance and everyone wants to just focus on sort of like, you know, the black and white and the rush to kind of come to what's the answer. But the reality is that there's so many layers in our lives and for the mashup experience in particular, so much of what we're doing is healing. And healing is a process of grief and acceptance and reconciling paradoxes and truths that are seemingly in contradiction. Like it's an ongoing
there's so
journey.
Many of them.
I know. There's so much. And it's like, it's what gives us our superpowers too. Right. You know? So both, right? And you don't end up wanting to do things in the world unless you've had some sort of trauma. Like nobody, right? Like the reason for change and bigger things and different things comes from people who have sore spots and hard spots, right?
I think something that Rebecca and I have thought about a lot, especially like I think maybe like in the past year or two, we've both been talking a lot about like our scar tissue. Just being like, oh, that was my scar tissue. Or like, ooh, that was a bruise that I poked by accident.
Or my therapist calls it an old wound.
Old wounds. And part of it, I think, has been just like as... I'm just going to psychoanalyze myself and Rebecca right now. But that like we're like now at a point where we have done so much personal work where like it's not that the wounds have necessarily healed or like gone away. It's just like, oh, we're very aware of where they are now.
Yeah.
So we can treat them tenderly.
Yeah. And you can be curious about them. We were talking about curiosity, right? Right. There's like a meta-ness to it. It's not as raw.
Yeah.
And the cycle of it is shorter, right? Like you see it, you're aware of it, and you kind of, right? What we were talking about, the awareness of anger or curiosity about a feeling, and you can like mine it quickly versus like, oh, there are other feelings which are like maybe in this stage of our lives as with young children, right? There's different versions, which we'll I think probably only understand in 20 more years from now, which was like, wow, that really inflamed me in this way. And I have no idea why, because I'm just so in it, or the constancy of that. That's a different one than my relationship totally to myself versus as a parent, right? Like, and I do think some of this, what you're talking about, the finding the reason or the way or that you approach some of the tools that you're, especially like, I found myself saying out loud to my kids, I was like, okay, I'm feeling very short right now because I did not exercise. And for me, exercise is like a way of getting out energy that is very specific that I really need. And so I'm like, I just like said it out loud.
I love that you said that to your kids.
Yeah. And it didn't stop me from being short but I did say it.
But they understood why.
Yeah.
Which is huge.
Well, I don't know if they understood, but they heard the words.
They were exposed
to that idea.
Yes.
And so it was almost like I hadn't been so acutely aware of that even for myself. I was like, oh, I feel like because I didn't move enough and I didn't like sweat in a way that not because of calories and not because of weight, but just because that is a kind of that I need that my blood flow that way. It feels good to me.
Kind of a lot of what we're talking about here is psychological flexibility. And that's a concept that in Real Self-Care I keep coming back to. It's like the skill of being able to work with your mind, like the curiosity, the being able to feel something hard and then ask yourself questions and give yourself space between, not just kind of like rushing to action or rushing to some sort of conclusion, but where you can feel or think a hard thought, let's say guilt, but then say, oh, okay, like I felt that. It's not the end of the world, right? I can engage with it, be curious about it, learn more about myself, as opposed to thinking it's just sort of like a damning, report card score.
Well, and there's two specific pieces of language that you used. Whatever words, that's another way to say it. They're phrases that you use in this. One is in the book, eudaimonic well-being. Can you define that for us here?
Yeah. So eudaimonic well-being is a theory of well-being that says that understanding your values and your purpose and the meaning of your life is what gives you the most well-being. So aligning your actions and your relationships and how you spend your energy with what means the most to you leads to a good life. This is in contrast to hedonic well-being, which prioritizes happiness or the absence of suffering. So hedonic well-being is sort of equivalent to like getting that like 600 calorie Starbucks drink that tastes really good in the moment, kind of negates all your stresses and pressures, and feels good. Whereas eudaimonic well-being says that no, actually it's about understanding what you really care about and naming that and then doing those things. And I also just want to say one thing too, is that we're all human. So like, of course we also all engage in hedonic well-being too, right? Like, so please don't shame yourself if you're like, well, but I really like my Starbucks drinks. Like, fine. Like I'm not trying to take those away from you.
Extremely interested in my hedonic side. Yeah. That is a big priority for me, but I see the appeal.
Yeah.
I think another thing you were talking about was cognitive diffusion strategies. And this seems to me what you're saying, like the incremental curiosity and questioning. Is that right?
Yeah. So cognitive diffusion basically refers to being able to, quote unquote, diffuse from hard feelings and hard thoughts. So one of the examples that I use in the book is like with guilt, right? Especially for women, anytime you set a boundary, anytime you say no or push back, you automatically make yourself the bad guy and feel guilty. So cognitive diffusion says instead of sort of fusing with that guilt, instead of believing that guilt is powerful, like all powerful, there are other strategies that you can use to help your mind create distance from the guilt. You're not turning off the guilt because we live in a world that is deeply inequitable and unfair. So you will always feel guilty because society has made women and women of color feel like everything is their job. So yes, you will feel guilty when you set a boundary. That's not your fault. So to get to the cognitive fusion, one of the tools to access that is to think of like metaphors. And that's a way to kind of work with your brain to just create a different context for it. So one of the metaphors I use in the book is to think of guilt as a faulty check engine light on your car. So imagine that, you've taken your car to get serviced, everything's fine, the oil's changed, but there's just one of those lights on the dash. It keeps going off no matter what you do, but it doesn't actually give you any meaningful information. It's broken. But it's still going off, right? So it's just background noise.
This check engine light is always on.
It's always on.
It's a lemon. This car is a lemon.
Right? It's a background noise. And so that's one example where you're kind of, again, you're working with your thoughts, you're working with your brain in a different way. And we call that diffusion. This comes from acceptance and commitment therapy. This isn't my idea. This is coming from therapy that is evidence-based. And it's a way to loosen things up. So you're not just beating yourself up all the time.
Can we talk just briefly about guilt for mashups? You give a few examples for you as a South Asian woman, but, can we just dive into that a little? Because guilt is a major theme in our work, always has been. It's like a section of our website, literally.
We're like 87% guilt. The rest is lattes, but
yeah,
a lot of
lattes
guilt
and guilt. Something so specific. Whenever I meet people who's they don't have guilt, I'm like, what?
What are you talking about?
It's truly like an alien species. Can you give a couple of examples for you from your own life as you do in the book about how you've navigated using some of these strategies and the types of guilt I think our listeners will really resonate with, things that have bubbled up that you've had to kind of silence the killjoys, as you said,
Yeah, well, the example that I use in the book was my first marriage. And that time in my life when I was, in my early mid-20s, and it was sort of all my best friends were getting married and my parents expected me to get married, right? And especially in South Asian culture, that milestone, that feeling of oh, now our daughter has, our daughter is someone else's responsibility. And I think, I talk about this in the context of boundaries, actually.
Yeah.
Right? Because I didn't know how to set that boundary. I didn't even know that I wasn't, none of this was at the conscious level at that time. This is all, we were talking about how now we're able to sort of be a little bit more curious about our wounds. At that time, this was all a wound. I didn't know. There was no strategy.
You were just one big wound.
I was one big wound. Yes. Yeah. I was one big wound. Yes. I think that's fair. So the reason that I didn't set the boundary was because of the guilt, right? The guilt, the fear of the guilt
this is so
was
relatable.
what prevented me. But the problem there is that the longer you let that run, the worse the damage is on the other side.
But then here's another addendum, is that when you've done the work and you do set those boundaries or you say them very clearly,
people are still mad at you?
They're mad or they don't even know what you're saying. They're not,
psychologically minded.
Correct. That you say,
I'm not going to be a doctor.
No, you say I can't come to that trip. I mean, you had an example in your book, I'm unable to join that family function. It just doesn't work for our family. And then you hear their story to someone else about you, and she's just, I don't know why. And I'm like, no, I told you exactly why. There was no confusing language. They can't hear it because they've projected a whole nother story on it. But you said exactly the words that you meant. And so that's been for me, a very interesting challenge of boundary setting, which is like, I set a boundary, but nobody heard it.
Yes. Oh, I love this. I think this is like very mashup specific, especially in dealing with families, right? And different degrees of cultural awareness and psychological awareness and ways of being in the world. So I think one thing I would say is that anytime you're setting a boundary, there's always two processes that are going on. There is just the actual like technical communication of the boundary, like what you're describing, Rebecca, of like saying like, this is our, and short and sweet. And here's the thing. Yeah. And then there's this whole other side of dealing with your emotional response.
Yes.
And any emotional response that's coming from them.
Yes.
And the thing is that you can't expect to get your emotional needs met from the family member who you're setting the boundary with.
Yeah.
So what you're saying right now is sort of like, but they're not voicing understanding to me.
Yes.
Like I explained, but they're not coming back and saying, yes, that makes sense. They've actually like totally misconstrued it and like made up something else, which they will do. They will do. But that's not your business. That's not up to you. Like that's just what it is. And you let that go. That's the cost, right?
Yeah.
And so in the book, I talk about how a boundary isn't always a no. I say that the boundary is the pause. And in the pause, you decide yes, no, or negotiate. And you're doing that mental calculus.
Right.
Is the no worth it? Because you know there's going to be drama, right? Sometimes the no isn't worth it. And if the no's not worth it right at this particular instance in your life, then you mark it for yourself and you say, 6 months later, I want to be at a place where the no is more accessible and maybe there's less drama with the no. Every family is different though. So you have to, like, I think cultural understanding is really important here because there's some families in which you actually can't even communicate that boundary because communicating verbally or over email or text, the boundary is too inflammatory.
Yeah.
Oh, look, here's my hand. It's being raised in the air.
You just have to act. You just have to act as if you've communicated it because the cost and the way that it inflames is actually counterproductive.
Yeah. And I think what you're saying, Pooja, I feel so deeply about, how specific this kind of guilt is to mashups and particularly to mashup daughters, because I think it's everything from Rebecca having to say no and wanting to be understood to like me being like, okay, well, it turns out maybe the life that I have chosen to live and devote myself to is just not worth it to my parents. That like everything they did, like the way that you describe your grandfather and like the building a life here and then doing this and that you're like, okay, well, thank you for that. And that's what you want for me is not what I want. But it's like a whole life.
Yeah.
And it feels like an abnegation of like their whole lives because they've been telling you your whole life that they did everything for you.
Yep.
I'm saying they. I don't know why as if this is not involving all of us directly right here.
It's so funny. As you're talking, I'm having an association to when I was in college, my mom would bring me these Tupperwares of Indian food. Every week.
You think that my roommate Geeta and I didn't get from New York City where I was in college, from Dallas, Texas, we would get overnighted.
Yeah.
It was, anyways, It was a great thing for me personally, but go on.
And it was always in the, because we were an immigrant family, it was in those Cool Whip containers.
Yes. Oh, 100%. Right? That were like dyed a little orange on the inside.
Turmeric dyed Cool Whips.
And I would have to keep all of those Cool Whip containers and return them. And I would feel so guilty if I didn't keep the containers. And then when I didn't eat the food, but the containers, I felt guilty about the containers.
Yeah.
My God. Yeah.
We were just talking about we should have a guide on our site for like, or what are the ways that you recycle, or like it's sort of in the spirit of environmental
How many
stuff.
times do you wash a Ziploc bag?
Yeah, or like
reused
where
tinfoil?
do you keep the bags that are left over from whatever shop? And mine is just like there's like a bag under the sink with all the bags in it, just like bags
Yeah,
and bags and bags.
Yeah. Bag of bags.
Neil's always like, how many bags in a bag can you have?
But like, white man, you don't understand.
But like that's your level when you're like in your early 20s and that's the level of guilt that you feel, then how, just again, to imagine being able to say to a parent, this life that you have dreamed of for me is not the life that I want for myself. Like it's soul crushing.
Mm-hmm. And I think part of it's soul crushing for yourself, and you kind of I felt like the whole, that like sublimating, the same thing about like pleasure. It's just like you hold it back because you feel responsible for their souls. And that
it's a duty, it's duty and it's enmeshment, and it's also like culture, right? Of more communal cultures, right? Like you represent your family in this way. So it's tough.
there's so many different ways to feel guilty.
But I will say, as a person filled with guilt, I also with there's branches of this mashup boundary guilt tree that we're drawing here, and mine is a family that actually I think I'm living the life that they did dream for me.
Yeah.
And there's still so many versions of it, like marrying non-Jewish person, which there's many settings of but with that, I mean, that was very fraught for me and a lot of pain, but that has come out so beautifully. But like you're saying, like the work, it pays off eventually.
Yes.
It does pay off. And what's interesting is Amy actually has an Asian female therapist specifically for this point of it being like, because of some of the cultural stuff where if someone could say, well, you just tell them that you're, and you're like, okay, cool story.
Are you kidding me? What are you talking
Tell
about?
who? Tell one person. What?
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, I think that was something so significant. And I'm sure some of your patients seek you out the same way. Like, I went on a hunt for a therapist, and I was like, they don't maybe have to be Korean American, but they have to be East Asian. They have to be first generation in America. My therapist is Japanese American. She has been in 2 mashup marriages, has mashup kids. Like that was essential for me to have a shortcut, to not have to explain everything.
Yeah, to speak the same language. Yeah.
Yeah. And I just think, so one thing, my last question is about boundaries, which are, I would say, early in life, like the first 30 some years were probably the scary, like that was not even a word that like I could say in my mouth. What would be your tip? Like, what's your advice for somebody, a woman who is like, I'm ready. I'm maybe like gonna go do my first one, or like I'm gonna say this scary thing, or I'm gonna try and do some body work and not be stressed out on the massage table. Like how does somebody, like, what would you say is like somebody's hype woman to setting a boundary?
Yeah. So the first is, it's the pause, right? It doesn't have to always be no. It could be first setting that pause and thinking in that time, what do I want? What does my body want? What do I really care about? Start small. Like, don't take on a big thing. Start with something that's low stakes. Like saying no to a friend who is not going to lash out on you, right? Like, don't pick your like toxic friend where there's lots of frenemy girl drama. Like, pick somebody who's actually like
that's
a real
not your
friend.
Also,
Right?
Stop
That's
being
not,
friends
thank
with
you.
that person.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
okay.
That's actually the answer. Stop being friends with that person. But don't pick that as your first boundary.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you've never done it before, that's going to be fraught. Sometimes it's even like the smallest thing, like you're going out to dinner with people and somebody asks you, where do you want to eat? What are you feeling like? And someone else says sushi, and actually saying like, I don't want sushi. Can we pick something else? Like, just small challenges. Don't start with your family. Setting boundaries with your family is the hardest thing. So practice a lot in spaces that are safer first, where you can just like build the muscle, use the scripts, see what happens, like just sort of like get into that bodily practice, and then take it to your family. And even when you start with your family, start, with a sibling, if there's a nice sibling, right? Like, don't start with like the most complicated relationship.
Oops. Glad we can be together in this.
Yes.
That feels important. That's significant.
Well, Pooja, this is such a joy.
Oh, I love it so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pooja.
We'll talk to you so soon.
It was such a joy. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pooja, for guiding us through this woolly world of boundaries and saying no.
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 I felt crazy. Okay, go on.
No, I won't.
So, you guys, what is a boundary that you are setting? Our goal for this month as we launch into holiday season is to set a boundary with our family and keep it. We can do it. I have faith.
And next week, we're so excited for Jeff Chang, our brother from another mother, the brilliant journalist and historian and expert in all things hip-hop and Bruce Lee. He'll be on to talk about why hip-hop matters to mashups and how we can get deep on the culture while being true to ourselves.
Catch the rest of the ultimate guide to a mashup life. We'll have episodes every week, all fall. Like and follow the Mashup Americans wherever you get your pods, and tell your friends. Love you.
Bye.
This podcast is a production of the Mashup Americans. It is executive produced by Amy S. Choi and Rebecca Lair. Senior editor and producer is Sarah Pellegrini. Production manager is Shelby Samlin. Thanks to DJ Rob Swift for our theme song, Salsa Scratch. Additional engineering support by Pedro Rafael Rosado. Please make sure to follow and share this show with your friends.